Buonciao a tutti Stumani, Sturagno qui e benvenuti in questo nuovo video. Quest'oggi tornano le reaction agli scenari di altra gente. Sempre dello stesso Ciccio perché Ciccio, sì, simpatico, sì, fa dei buoni video. È di Rewriting History e anche di US of Z. Non ho la minima idea di chi sia. Comunque, mettete like, iscrivetevi a entrambi. Io sono già iscritto a Writing History, mi iscrivo anche a US of Z. Iscrivetevi a me, mettete like a me questo video che faccio il reality check a tutti i scenari. E a questo punto possiamo entrare nel video, che è guardare un video dentro il video. Sono così le reaction in realtà, ladri di contenuti. Beh, vediamo un po' se questo scenario è accurato.
Germany was blamed for being responsible for the Great
Aspettate che...
War because of the
Oddio, che è
unconditional support.
successo? Aspettate però che metto i sottotitoli in italiano. In abcaso, ragazzi, in abcaso li metto. Ok, possiamo tornare all'inizio del video.
Germany was blamed for being responsible for the Great War because
Vero,
of the unconditional support they gave to Austria-Hungary in an
vero
event
anche
of war with
questo.
Serbia, where Russia was also assumed that they would join. Germany had to do it before Russia industrialized and completed the Trans-Siberian Railway, and also Germany had made
L'ha
plenty
fatto,
of enemies, with the Habsburgs being their only real ally. However, what if Germany
Beh,
never
anche
gave this
l'Italia era alleata
unconditional
dal
support to
tedesco
Austria-Hungary,
e anche
resulting in no
abbastanza la
Great
Romania.
War, but also in straining of relations between the German powers? This video is a collaboration with the US of Z, who won a quiz game for my 100,000 subscribers live stream. Here he is going to explain the history behind it and also set up the point of divergence.
Ah, ok,
Then
bene.
I'm going to continue it after him and nuke the fridge and make something completely unreasonable. Let me show you what we came up with.
Following the unification of Germany in 1871, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had pursued a policy of continental
Sì,
stability,
questo da spiegare.
much in line with Clemens von Metternich's original Concert of Europe framework. It was a politique intended to carefully manage the European balance of power and avoid unnecessary
Sì.
hostility with, in particular, the British Empire.
In realtà è prima coi francesi, però vabbè, dipende dal contesto storico.
Britain, for much of the 19th century, had suffered a sort of Napoleon neurosis, or a fear of any
Vero, vero.
one European power dominating the continent. They
E
intervened in
infatti
wars like
poi
the
la
Crimean
Germania
War
diventa
to displace
strapotente.
countries they saw as gaining disproportionate power. However, the Bismarckian policy of stability was eventually replaced in the 1890s with a new policy called Weltpolitik, the pursuit of Germany's place in the sun. Germany underwent rapid industrialization, beginning to outpace Britain in steel production, and pursued colonial and international prestige. Britain was wary of this rise. Most alarming to the British was Admiral Alfred von Tippett's growth of the German Navy, a policy
Io non capisco se questo è il punto di divergenza o ancora la spiegazione. Beh, sapremo dopo.
which was explicitly designed to prevent Britain from being able to leverage their Royal Navy in war with Germany. That is, making war with Germany unacceptably costly for the British. Britain answered with their Dreadnought project in 1906, simultaneously settling their colonial rivalries with France and Russia through the Entente Cordiale and Anglo-Russian Convention. These agreements
Sì.
solidified into an anti-German alliance in due time. By 1912, a final diplomatic attempt at Anglo-German reconciliation, called the Haldane Mission, collapsed when Germany demanded a pledge of British neutrality in any continental war.
Ci sono stati altri tentativi, no? No, mi sembra che nel 61 la Germania ha cercato di allearsi sia alla Russia sia alla Gran Bretagna. O forse era nel 66 con la Gran Bretagna, perché nel 61 con la Russia. Comunque sì, si può parlare anche di quello. Forse c'è già uno scenario di quello. Se lo trovo, il prossimo video è di quello.
A condition that Britain obviously rejected out of fear of losing France. Within 2 years, Archduke Franz Ferdinand would be assassinated.
Poverino.
Austria-Hungary blamed the country of Serbia, for whom Russia considered itself a protector. On July 5th, Kaiser Wilhelm II met with the Austro-Hungarian ambassador and delivered Germany's blank check, an unconditional promise that Germany would stand by its ally even if Russia intervened.
Ecco, questa mi sembra un po' una cavolata. Bravo Guglielmo II, oh, bravo William II, bravo Wilhelm the Ninth, detto in tutte e tre le lingue possibili che so di questo argomento. Cioè, non ha senso. Onestamente non ha senso, perché? L'Austro-Ungheria è una gran potenza, era una gran potenza, un po' in declino, ma in una gran potenza. La Germania non aveva bisogno di entrare nella guerra, si sarebbe tirata nei casini solo se l'intervento russo ci sarebbe stato, ma sarebbe poi entrata in una guerra a due fronti e con l'alleato russo già preparato e quindi alleato russo, se i russi già preparati e quindi il piano Schniffeln non sarebbe riuscito.
The German leadership viewed it as a calculated risk. A swift Austrian strike against Serbia, they reasoned, would catch Russia off guard and force a diplomatic resolution. Many in the German military establishment went further, arguing that if a confrontation with Russia was inevitable, it was better sooner than later, before Russia completed its massive rail construction, industrialization, and rearmament program funded.
Già, l'ha finito tipo 2 settimane prima dell'inizio della Grande Guerra.
By French loans and set to be completed in 1917. So,
L'ha fatto nel 14.
Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia on July 23rd, which was deliberately designed to be impossible to accept, with demands including Austrian participation in the judicial investigation on Serbian soil.
Aspetta che li leggo. Uh, ban di, vabbè, media, informazioni anti-austro-ungariche. Cos'è? Ah sì, di togliere i gruppi terroristi, togliere il materiale anti-austro-ungarico dalle scuole, eh, tutti i politici e generali austro-ungarici devono essere licenziati, tutti gli austro-ungarici possono aiutare, cioè far aiutare e farsi aiutare dagli austro-ungarici a, come si dice, opprimere i movimenti, quelli per la libertà della Bosnia, quelli là. Far sì che investigatori austriaci lì potessero entrare in Serbia per investigare e questo è quello che la Serbia come si dice, ha rifiutato perché era contro la Costituzione. Arrestare uno e due, che sono due complici di Gavrilo Princip. Non so cosa voglia dire smuggling, andiamo a cercarlo. Bandire il contrabbando di armi. Eh, non so cosa sia. Non so, e questi due non riesco a leggerli. Vabbè, ve li leggete voi e vi guardate il video da soli. Tanto il link è in descrizione.
Which directly violated Serbia's constitution. Serbia's reply
Infatti,
was, to
dicevo
nearly
io.
everyone's surprise, to actually accept every single demand except for that one. Wilhelm II himself declared it a great moral victory for Vienna and said that with it all reason for war is gone. The Austrians, however, never really intended to negotiate. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia over that single refused demand. Germany was then
Però...
pulled in, and the alliance systems of the
palle.
Entente, whose full weight Germany had fatally underestimated, took over from there, and the world was thrust into the horrors of the Great War. But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Germany sided with the Entente? The idea of
Della
Kaiser
formica? Ah, perché ha sentito Ant.
Wilhelm II's Germany siding with the Entente is, in a sense, a complete rewriting, see what I did there, of what Wilhelmine Germany represented. The Germany that issued the blank check did so as an expression of a particular political order and a set of military and economic interests whose internal logic made sense at the time. So for Germany to act differently in the July crisis, we have to create, to some degree, a sort of different Germany. To do this, we need to
Perché Napoleone? Perché Napoleone? Perché questa immagine è bellissima. Dopo me la prendo e la salvo come sfondo del computer.
identify which features of the Wilhelmine system, if altered, could cause the other ones to follow. The Anglo-German naval rivalry came about because Britain's empire and strategic doctrine were built around its navy and the two-power standard, that the Royal Navy should always be stronger than the second and third most powerful navies combined. German naval expansion
Ora la Cina e gli USA stanno mandando la British Navy a fanculo. A fanculo. E- No, quante marine sono più forti della British Navy? Cina, USA, Giappone, India, Francia, Italia, sono circa allo stesso livello. Però sì. Comunque, è forte. E dobbiamo cambiare tutti sti punti, sono un casino. Cioè, rivalità sui mari. Certo, perché ai britannici non gli frega niente dei mari, sono una cazzo di isola. Ah, ma vabbè, sulla Russia che devo far veloce, spiegato prima, l'alleanza, il revanchismo per l'Alsazia e l'Orrena che mi hanno ciulato il territorio, ovviamente lo vogliamo. Però Francia, quando voi ci avete ciulato Nizza, la rivogliamo. Comunque sì, quello è un altro gran problema e questo non so cosa sia. Comunque sì, sono in tantissimi problemi da... Cioè, la Germania non poteva stare con l'entente. È più probabile che ci sia stata l'Austria a tradire l'Ungheria. Alcuni dicono l'Ungheria se avesse tradito l'Austria. Che poi il bro assassinato era anche ungherese, quindi. La Germania proprio odiava tutti i membri dell'entente. Cioè, odiava soprattutto la Gran Bretagna, erano più la Russia e la Francia che odiavano la Germania, e quindi però si è formato un odio reciproco.
made British alignment with Germany unthinkable. German anxiety over Russia's armament and industrial program also convinced German planners that war in 1914 was better than waiting and getting attacked
Sono
by a
stanco.
stronger Russia down the line. Additionally, the Austro-German alliance itself, who Germany's chancellor described as their only even marginally dependable ally, paradoxically gave Austria disproportionate leverage over German decision-making during the crisis.
Ecco, sei un coglione. Sei un coglione, fatelo dire. Geni, siete alleati dell'Italia, degli Ottomani, della Romania, della Bulgaria. Perché affidarsi su uno stato in decadimento quando vabbè, anche gli ottomani sono in decadimento. Quando tipo l'Italia stava crescendo. Affidati più su di quello. Ti serve di più. Cosa fai? Vuoi essere trascinati in una guerra nel quale non c'entri? No. Poi bro erano alleati anche abbastanza vicini pure agli Stati Uniti. Pure agli Stati Uniti. Se non facessero queste mosse così austro-ungheresi, ma si avvicinassero più agli Stati Uniti, magari potevano avere una mutua difesa tra loro due. E invece no, devi fare lo scemo. Bravo.
France had also been locked in a state of revanchism since the Franco Prussian War, a
Infatti.
revanchism so intense that it was ingrained in young school children. And finally,
Minchia.
and perhaps most fundamentally, German military and foreign policy was led by a strategic clique centered on the Army General Staff, which was largely
Epic.
insulated from oversight from Parliament and German business interests.
Anche questo è
These
epic.
strategic variables were synergistic, they reinforced one another. The naval rivalry poisoned Anglo German relations, which made the Entente appear more threatening, which made
E
Austria
con questo
Hungary appear more
poster sul mio libro
indispensable,
di
which
storia.
made a preventative war appear more rational, which the German General Staff's autonomy made more plausible. At the center of this chain was the constitutional structure of the German state.
Ok, analizziamo. Eh, quindi i bro qui sono, sono due cose separate.
If we solve for this, we don't dissolve every obstacle. For example,
Però c'è il Kaiser e il cancelliere. eh, vabbè, parla con gli altri stati, si occupa della diplomazia, mentre c'è un altro super scollegato che si occupa della militare. E a volte l'altro tizio, il generale assoluto, può anche andare sopra il Kaiser. Allora, prima di tutto questa parte va cancellata. Poi questi due devono parlarsi molto di più.
Example, France's revanchism over Alsace-Lorraine, but we do
Infatti.
produce conditions under which the others become negotiable. The economic foundation for a reorientation to the Entente is also, paradoxically, actually greater than we might expect. In 1913, 36% of German trade was conducted with Britain, France, Russia, and Italy, while its actual allies
Quello che ho detto prima, che ti ne frega dell'Austro-Ungheria. C'hai l'Italia, c'hai USA, the USA. Sei un genio proprio te, sei un genio. Poi, se fai tutto questo con il tuo rivale, cioè, ovviamente Cina e Stati Uniti sono grandissimi partner, però gli Stati Uniti sono più partner di, che ne so, il Regno Unito o la Germania. Mentre no, due top rivali non dovrebbero far così. La Germania aveva in quel tempo delle policies, le chiamerò così perché non si dice, non so come si dice in italiano, stupidissime, stupide. Cambiale e o vinci la guerra o la eviti pure, che pure è meglio.
Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria accounted for only 12% of German commerce combined. Of course, most of Germany's trade was with the United States and other American countries, as well as the Swedes and the Dutch. But Britain was Germany's single largest customer, and Germany was Britain's second largest market. In Norman Engel's The Great Illusion, he argues that the density of credit and trade between major industrial powers renders war economically irrational and militarily disastrous. That actually describes the economic relationship between Germany and Britain at this time. The problem was, the German planners were largely insulated from the people for whom that rationalist argument was most compelling: business and commercial interests. These businessmen and merchants and industrialists were excluded from the strategic clique that issued the blank
Ecco,
check,
geni,
again, the German General Staff. And their shock at the outbreak of the war suggests that they had not been consulted about that decision, which would go on to destroy
geni
their
parte
markets
2.
with Britain. So, in our alternate Germany, foreign policy must be made accountable to the Reichstag, which can serve as a vessel for commercial interests. That means the General Staff cannot be isolated from the rest of the German elected government. This concept is not actually alien to German intellectuals. Figures like Walter Rothenau and Max Warburg
Il Broly.
advocated for an economic general staff. They wanted the markets to play a greater role in grand planning. So the parliamentary route that we've suggested would simply be to give such voices, the industrialists, the businessmen, etc., a new formal power over decisions that, in the July crisis of our history, were made without them. With
Allora, eh, parlate prima di tutto commercialmente, perché questa guerra, uno, vi logora l'economia. Germania, non andare in guerra con il tuo più grande esportatore, perché poi cosa è successo? Sei stato bloccato e morivi di fame. C'è un'altra cosa che potevi fare, ovvero ridare l'Alsazia-Lorena alla Francia in cambio di tantissimi soldi, o magari solo la Lorena, così non sei più nemico della Francia, puoi diventare più amico con la Gran Bretagna, la Russia, vabbè, non ci puoi fare niente, Germania e Russia sono sempre nemici, e poi andare liberamente, oppure puoi comprare queste isole dalla Gran Bretagna così puoi andarci liberamente e non c'è nessun blocco.
such a voice, the business elite would rightly argue that the disruption of trade with Britain would be economically disastrous to Germany, and they would also pursue accommodation during the Haldane mission, which will effectively put a slow and steady end to the naval arms race with Britain. Business interests might also abandon the Juncker preferred policy of agricultural protectionism, which would reduce friction with Russia, whose economy relied on grain exports. So, this alternate Germany, oriented toward a new economic access with Britain, slowly, not immediately, but over time throughout the early 1900s and 1910s, would pursue an arrangement not unlike that which we saw in the final Baghdad railway negotiations.
Che è sta roba? Perché non ne ho mai sentito parlare? Ah, è tipo una... una ferrovia enorme per connettere tutti gli alleati tedeschi tranne l'Italia perché l'Austria e l'Italia si odiano. E poi non era alleato anche abbastanza di... No, chi era... Ah vabbè, USA e anche il Giappone. Non erano così nemici, poi sono entrati in guerra contro. Sia con l'Italia sia con il Giappone. Vedi? Vedi, se negletti i tuoi amici, poi succede questo. Ricordatevi, ragazzi, avete degli amici e lasciatevi amici. Amici, amici, poi ti rubano la bici. Meno male che poi sono amici, quindi te la ridanno al compleanno per farvi una sorpresa pazza. Non so più di cosa sto parlando. Comunque, bel progetto. Peccato che non è fatto. Ma qua letteralmente dove sta andando? Cioè, questo va a Pola, questo va a Beirut. Vabbè, questo sembra Hamburgo. E qua non mi ricordo come si chiama la città. Comunque, beh.
where the Deutsche Bank had accepted a secondary role behind the British capital in exchange for stability and market access to the Ottoman Empire. Germany will serve the role of a junior partner in global finance to the British, which isn't necessarily even national humiliation so long as it is framed through Bismarckianism. After all, this rationalist politic was the role Bismarck played from time to time in his era.
Infatti, allora, una grandissima cosa è che queste decisioni sono state fatte tutte dal Kaiser Guglielmo II, che era un idiota totale, era incompetente, lui pensava solo guerra, 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 e ha pure buttato fuori Bismarck per questo, perché Bismarck trattava con tutti, si interessava anche dell'economia invece che solo della guerra. Tenere Bismarck sarebbe stata una decisione molto migliore.
This would all be a rational expression of the state concluding that its interests lay in defending the existing
Scusate.
order, which was indeed the conclusion that Bismarck had drawn to be most beneficial in 1871, which he maintained until his dismissal by Wilhelm II.
Quello
So,
che dicevo io.
with this less Wilhelmine Germany, the July crisis becomes a different situation. First of all, the blank check would never be given. This Germany would actively insist on previewing the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia before it was sent. Further, the Germans would have
Meglio.
exercised the leverage they possessed. They would veto any conditions of the Austrian ultimatum they viewed as likely to incite war with Russia. Austria-Hungary was totally dependent on German backing, and so this Germany can force Austria toward moderation, however reluctantly. The
E
second
quindi toglierebbe quel punto là violato dalla Costituzione. E quindi niente guerra. Abbiamo trovato una soluzione. Adesso torniamo indietro nel tempo.
and more dramatic effect is that Germany would accept the proposal of Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, for a four-power conference. Historically, Germany rejected this British mediation initiative because they believed it would represent another political defeat on the world stage. It was honor politics, Weltpolitik. Our rationalist Germany, if you want to call it that, would not see this through the lens of Wilhelmine honor politics, but rather would have perceived Grey's proposal as an opportunity to demonstrate the role that Germany could play on the world stage. Germany and Britain, acting together as co-orbiters of this Balkan dispute, would constitute
Sì,
the
fa
most
abbastanza
powerful
tipo
possible signal that the
l'India.
July crisis could not escalate into a war. This four-power
L'India adesso, dico.
conference of Germany, Britain, France, and Italy would
Che
thus
se poi
likely have
c'entrano
produced
Italia e
a
Francia.
negotiated resolution along the lines that Grey had imagined. Serbia would face meaningful international punishment for the assassination
Mannaggia la miseria, io mi sto incavolando. Cos'è questa bandiera? Cos'è questa bandiera? Cos'è questa bandiera? Questa bandiera, se la devi mettere, metti anche quella ungherese. Questa non è l'Austria, è l'Austro-Ungheria. Se no, vedi questa Bosnia qua non ce l'avrebbe. Adesso, per favore, o metti entrambe le bandiere o metti quella austro-ungherese, anche perché si parla di guerra, è meglio mettere quel là con le bande strane. E poi, però, bravo che hai usato questa per l'impero russo.
so that Austria maintains its honor, but Serbian
Miseria,
veramente
veramente
territorial
soffro per
integrity would
ste
not be
cose.
violated, and Russian intervention would become unnecessary. Thus, the July
Io,
crisis would
scusate,
simply
sono
be a
stanco. Sto
continuation
registrando alle
of the
3
concert
di
order of
pomeriggio,
European
però.
politics. However, out of it, the alliance systems of Europe would immediately be rearranged. This quadruple entente,
Wow.
if you will, won't survive very long after these negotiations. Germany and Britain would be somewhat economically interdependent and diplomatically aligned, so to speak, in their initiatives. The great game between Britain and Russia might thus begin to reinitiate. Britain would find Germany to be a preferable partner in great power politics.
Sì, però il problema è che se la Gran Bretagna va contro la Russia, alleata della Francia, si trova contro la Francia, con cui teneva tanto essere alleato, perché la Francia vuole essere alleata della Gran Bretagna perché così la Francia e la Russia non si trovano la Gran Bretagna come grandissimo palo in culo. Ormai già la Gran Bretagna è contro, quindi la Francia si potrebbe schierare con loro. Loro potrebbero avere allora anche l'Austro-Ungheria e l'Italia B e altre potenze, direi il Portogallo è sempre allineato con la Gran Bretagna, ma da tipo 700 anni. È tipo l'alleanza più lunga di tutte. Mentre la Russia tirerebbe fuori alleati, magari avrebbe anche supporto nelle colonie britanniche, tipo in Pakistan, passerebbe dall'Afghanistan, manderebbe truppe rivoluzionarie, aiuto ai rivoluzionari e magari non dico tutto il Pakistan, ma magari la parte nord, magari anche solo il Kashmir diventerebbe indipendente. Però questo è troppo avanti, troppo irrealistico.
Which would essentially be a return to the, quote, free hand policy of the 1890s under Lord Salisbury. Russian encroachment in northern Persia and the secret Russian railway plans that threatened the approaches to India, which were already causing, quote,
Poi però anche la situazione col Giappone, il Giappone allora potrebbe avvicinarsi a nessuno dei due, quindi non entra in guerra, quindi la Russia deve tenere pure armi con il confine del Giappone, quindi spreco di armi. Però eh, ah, eh, sarebbe molto più vicino alla Persia, è vero,
acute concern in
perché la
Britain
Persia è
by
contro gli ottomani.
1914 would no longer be tolerated. France would also necessarily be thrown off by this alignment. A Germany that had successfully cozied up to Britain would not in and of itself resolve the Alsace question, as we noted, but it would render France's strategic framework for addressing it obsolete. France believed that it would regain Alsace-Lorraine through alignment with Russia in an inevitable war against Germany, encircling the Germans. Revanchism was thus a cornerstone of French national identity. So to ask France to abandon all of
Ma
that
quella è un'immagine
would
vera.
likely produce the conditions for a political crisis. What that means is France isn't going to be happy at this new British-German dance of sorts. To compound this, in our own
Danza.
history, French strategists feared that Britain or Russia might strike a separate bargain with Germany. This fear would, in our scenario, be a reality.
Poi la Russia
Now, France could either accept
non
a
l'ha fatto,
diminished
però
but
in modo
secure
diverso.
role as a continental power, adapting to this new Anglo-German concert in which its voice would no longer be indispensable, or it could resist the new alignment, retreating into a defensive nationalism that would leave it diplomatically isolated outside of Entente with Russia. In the short term, I believe the reflexive choice would likely be the latter, with France falling out with Britain and doubling down on the Franco-Russian alliance. Now, for Austria-Hungary, this would be an existential catastrophe. Germany had now, in effect, subjected Austrian policy to international review, making it clear that Austria was no longer being treated as a great power, and was now only capable of projecting influence so long as Germany permitted it. And the implicit balance of power that
Beh,
had
non era
restrained
più
Russian
grande
influence in
potenza
the
in ogni modo.
Balkans would now display cracks.
Alright, so Europe has survived the July crisis, but the alliances systems are still shaken. The major thing to look at would be between the Habsburgs and Germany. Technically,
Trovato
Austria got most of
il
what they
blu.
wanted and the great powers agreed to punish Serbia for their actions. However, Austria-Hungary still feels betrayed and like a subject of Germany. This huge rift is unlikely to close anytime soon. The French fear that Britain or Russia
Però a questo punto allora l'Austria-Ungheria potrebbe allenarsi nella Russia, quindi avremmo Germania, Gran Bretagna e Italia probabilmente contro Francia, Austria-Ungheria e Russia. Che scenario divertente.
would strike a separate deal with Germany, which fear is now a reality. As such, the Entente is shaken as well by this development of events. This means that the alliances would need to be reinforced, which is going to take
Ma
some
il problema
time,
è che tutti
even if
avrebbero una
everything
guerra a
else
due
remains.
fronti, cioè Germania, due fronti. tre fronti, oppure un fronte lungo, sempre col piano. Però il piano Schlieffen potrebbe funzionare perché potrebbero arrivare pure le truppe a fare tipo Normandia ma prima, e quindi la Francia cadrebbe prima, poi ci sarebbe magari anche l'Italia ad aiutarli a prendere per esempio la Corsica e bloccare il Mediterraneo, perché se c'hanno l'Italia con la Gran Bretagna come alleato, in realtà la Gran Bretagna aiuterebbe anche a aumentare la loro marina. Poi l'Austro-Ungheria, no, l'Austro-Ungheria è con la Russia, la cosa strana. L'Austro-Ungheria e l'Italia, vabbè, solita cosa, però c'è la Germania che spinge da nord. Ci sono i Sudeti qua, sono i Sudeti, sì. Però l'Austro-Ungheria collasserebbe più velocemente, poi magari anche con l'aiuto della Romania che era alleata tedesca. E sì, sarebbe tutto un casino.
Remains the same, a great war is still likely to happen, just later than historically, and perhaps it could look totally differently, where instead of trench warfare there would be tank battles in the early 1920s.
Epic.
Still going back to 1914 after the July crisis, I think that Europe would learn a key lesson. Their economies are way too connected, and if war were to break out, this would be economically devastating, not just the high cost of human life. As such, some European leaders would prefer to increase trade among the great powers and thus secure world peace forever. I think that
Per
Germany in this
sempre.
alternate history, considering the changes we had made to the capitalist upper
Una
class
prima
of their
guerra mondiale
society,
succederebbe
they
su.
could initiate for this. These people don't necessarily want more colonies and absolutely no wars to acquire more, but rather build more factories and grow their wealth. To them, Germany is already in a strong position to fulfill these goals. Further, they would see the large bear that is the Russian Empire and how their industrialization could eclipse Germany eventually. As such, I think the German landowners, wealthy families, and factory owners would be focused on staying ahead of Russia, which having a war would prevent them from doing so. The German Empire would
Poi però la Russia sarebbe comunque collassata se la, che ne so, la prima guerra mondiale sarebbe nel 1920, la Russia collasserebbe subito nella guerra, il che renderebbe le cose ancora più facili per la Germania. E magari si potrebbero pure pigliare un alleato in Finlandia, dato che aiutavano i, i bro russi, quindi non li vedono così male i finlandesi.
try to support these industrialists with a goal to
La
walk Europe into
neonata
economic
Finlandia.
dependence before Russia
Frecce!
catches up. To this, Germany would create an economic alliance which I'm going to call Mettere Europa. I know, very creative. Basically, Germany would
Mm.
invest into several countries under certain conditions. The main aspect of this economic alliance I see as Germany limiting the members of their alliance trade with Russia proportionally to the one of Germany. For my World War II enjoyers, think of this like the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, where Germany's navy was limited to 35% of the total tonnage of the British Navy.
Non
So, who
pensate a
joins this
quello, la prima
German-led
guerra mondiale
economic
è peggio
alliance?
della...
Well, the
è
enemies of
meglio della
Russia and
seconda.
opportunistic countries. Austria-Hungary, despite their grievances and the recent development of events, would be still isolated, hated by Serbia, Romania, Russia and Italy, almost all of their neighboring countries.
Anche la Germania non sarebbe così amica, e poi c'è l'altro, il Montenegro, che è praticamente Serbia, ma di nuovo, quindi sarebbe circondata da nemici l'Austro-Ungheria. Che bello questo, bro.
As such, Austria-Hungary physically cannot afford to break up with Germany and to go on their own. As such, the Habsburgs would join Mittel Europa. Another
Ah,
major Russian rival that would join would be the Ottoman Empire, which had vast resources but a lot of wasted potential due to their lack of industrialization. Mittel
bravi
Europa
geni,
would be
bravi!
beneficial for
Siete
the
tipo la
Ottomans and
Russia, ma ancora
Germany, as the
peggio.
Ottomans gain protection from Russia and grow stronger, while Germany gains more resources and strangles the Russians out. Minor members that I think would also join are Romania, because they would still feel threatened by Russia, and even though they don't
Ecco, questo vi
particularly
dico,
like
la
the
Romania era
Habsburgs either,
alleato
they would
della
know that once
Germania.
German investments hit Romanian soil, the Germany wouldn't want for the Habsburgs to conquer Romania
A questo punto però anche la
and
Bulgaria.
seize these. As such, Mittel Europa for Romania could be seen as a guarantee of non-aggression with Austria, while protecting the nation against Russia, despite only being an economic alliance. Greece and Bulgaria, I think that they could also join. Yes, they would have plenty of conflicts of interest, however, Mittel Europa is
Lo
an
so,
opportunity to
lo
get
cioè, lo
economically
sappiamo.
ahead, then to properly industrialize after centuries of Ottoman control, exploitation and restrictions. Italy would be an interesting country here. I do think that they would be
Infatti.
interested in this project, however, I wouldn't say that they would be among the founding members of this economic
Secondo me farebbero come o come la Svezia, vabbè, tutti gli altri che sono arrivati dopo, oppure come la Norvegia con l'UE, che ne fa parte de facto, però sulla carta non è un membro,
Alliance. This is because Russia is
ed
quite
è
far
proprio
away from the
nell'area Schengen.
Italians, while Italy still holds grudges against Austria-Hungary. For now, Italy would stay out. Now, I want to be clear that what I called Middle Europa is not a proto-European Union. There are still tariffs, custom duties, no freedom of movement or work,
Sì,
no shared laws, no shared governing
oh, ma
institutions and
aggiungo
so
stesso
on. It
paragone
is
e
just a
vedi.
trading bloc, that's it. Germany's first major moves could be the completion of the Berlin to Baghdad
Allora magari
railway,
anche
opening
l'Albania,
up the way to the Middle Eastern markets and resources. With that, Germany has secured a shield
che
around
è
Russia,
già
reducing the
che
Russian
l'Albania,
exports to a lot of these
vabbè,
member
parlerò,
states, which would
o
mean
anzi
less
non ne
profits
parlo.
for Russia
Ma
and
che
thus
cavolo,
slower
cosa?
industrialization, while Germany would invest into poorer countries like the Balkans to get them up to date, benefiting enormously. In this situation, even if Russia were to industrialize, there is not a huge market to sell to directly from land, and much of what they would produce would be used internally. The
Sulla
Russian Navy
Persia.
was never impressive, and there were several naval choke points. Two of them passed through Greece and the Ottomans, German economic allies. If Germany can gain Scandinavia on their side, they can restrict Russian exports by
Sì, ma il problema della Scandinavia è che sono neutrali, sono dei chill guys. E la Svezia e la Russia sono contro da anni, anni e anni.
land and sea, greatly slowing down their
Poi
industrialization.
la Svezia vedrebbe pure dei vantaggi essere contro la Russia perché magari in una caso di ribellione riuscirebbe a pigliarsi magari la Lapponia
Due to heavy
o la
tariffs
Finlandia
that the
intera,
alliance would
però
impose on
esageriamo.
Russian goods, or
Di
tolls for
sicuro
Russian
Haaland,
shipping
di sicuro
passing through
Haaland.
these key choke points. Sweden historically feared Russia, and now I bet that they would fear them even more into 1916, when Russia finishes the
Quello che
Trans-Siberian
dicevo.
Railroad and achieves an impressive industrialization with French investments. At the same time, Sweden was a country of 5.7 million people, while for Russia this would be a rounding error, as they had nearly 20 times higher population of 170 to 182 million
È vero,
people.
c'erano
For
così pochi,
similar
non c'era
reasons,
nemmeno
Scandinavia was geographically closer
come
to
l'ha
Germany and
battuta.
feared Russia, so their entry into
Vabbè, la
Middle
Svezia
Europa,
è
even as
piena di
associated
immigrazione, che non è
members,
mai
is
brutta cosa.
plausible. Tariffs between Middle Europa and the Scandinavian Economic Union, as it would become to be known, would be lowered, and Germany would invest into the region, particularly into Sweden. This can be in the
Infatti,
form of
da
expanding
prendere
the
tutto il
Lue-Narvik
ferro che
railway
serve.
to have more tracks, which is from where Sweden exported their iron ore, as it was
Quello
produced
che
in
ho
the
appena
north of the
detto, ma
country and their port of
sono un
Lue froze
predittore
for
del
half of
futuro.
the year, while Norway's Narvik was ice-free all year around.
Ah, poi
This
non
line
c'è
was
nessun
already
blocco
completed in
possibile.
1903, however from 1915 to 1923 it was electrified, which can happen sooner with German investments. Russia and France of course wouldn't be sitting idle while all of this is happening, so they would challenge Middle Europa by creating the EEU, or Entente Economic
EU! EU!
Union. Similarly to Middle Europa, promotes trades against member states, eventually lowering tariffs among member states and makes mutual investments much easier. Belgium and Luxembourg I think are members that could
Sì.
join this economic alliance right away, with Spain and Portugal also being possible.
Portogallo non lo
Montenegro and
so.
Serbia are going to join for
Ah sì,
obvious
quelli sì, quelli sì.
reasons. In terms of population, the Entente Economic Union would be vastly ahead.
Però io direi che allora il Portogallo non entrerebbe, la Spagna magari è un membro associato come questi qua, però membri associati ci sarebbe anche l'Olanda e l'Albania e magari anche la Persia, anche se non è europea. Però, come dico sempre, chi se ne frega.
Not just because of Russia, but also France's vast colonial empire. Still Middle Europa with a
Aspetta, ho visto una cosa
not just
strana.
because of Russia, but also France.
Letteralmente che cazzo è questo e che cazzo è questo? Cosa sono sti due robe? Che cosa sono? Beh, lo scopriremo in futuro. Ditemelo nei commenti se lo sapete.
France's vast colonial empire. Still, Middle Europa with a lower population could have a higher purchasing power. For example, Sweden's GDP in 1914 was roughly $415 million, using 1914 dollars not accounting for inflation. On the other hand, France's African colonies combined had a GDP of between 100 million and 150
Minchia.
million dollars in 1914, not accounting for inflation. To simplify, Sweden's economy in 1914 was between 3 and 4 times larger than the entirety of French Africa. As such, Middle Europe and the Entente Economic Union would be of similar strengths, but undeniably the Entente Economic Union would have the highest potential, with Russian and French colonies industrializing. What is also interesting to mention is that Middle Europe would kind of resemble NATO, although not a military alliance. NATO was created historically to contain the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. Middle
È
Europe would be
vero.
created in this alternate history to contain
Epic.
Imperial Russia economically, slowing them down as much as possible.
Però a questo punto, se succede questo, niente rivoluzione comunista in Russia. Perché sarebbe strano. No, vabbè, mi sa che è un gran ritardo. Ma appena scoppia la guerra, rivoluzione comunista? Andate a cagare. Oppure magari questi paesi allora, per essere contro i russi, finanzierebbero pure i comunisti in Russia. Epic. A questo punto potrebbero finanziarli anche in Iran, dove sono arrivati molto dopo, così di stabilizzare la Russia con un loro
With
alleato.
many countries increasing tariffs on Russian goods and lowering them amongst each other. Now to address the elephant in the room, the largest economy in the world at the time, Great Britain. Because of how the US of Z developed the scenario, Britain could plausibly join either economic bloc and ensure their victory. So what would happen? Under these circumstances, Britain would be wary of both sides, mostly of Germany if I had to guess, because of the huge German sphere of influence in Europe, going from Scandinavia to Mesopotamia. Britain, as the largest navy in the world, had one big goal, which was to prevent Europe from falling to one country, that would build railways and connect the continent.
Genio! Allora se un genio entra con la Germania, e quindi sono due le grandi potenze. Quanto fa uno più uno? 11. Stai zitto. Fa 2.
Negating Britain's advantage of naval trade. We saw this historically with the Berlin to Baghdad railway. Britain didn't actually oppose it. However, when the railway was planned to be extended to Basra, near British Kuwait, this is when the British protested this construction. In this alternate scenario, Germany and Russia would be equally seen as threatening to British
Belle le
economic
bandiere di
dominance due
fianco.
to their intercontinental railways. So the best course of action for Britain would be neutrality, and to let both sides fight it out militarily, not economically, then mediating the peace treaty to ensure that neither side would come out too powerful, giving Britain the edge after the war. Now by the
Il problema è che a sto punto gli Stati Uniti ne hanno già sorpassati.
year of 1916, we could see Middle Europe to deepen their economic ties. For example, they could initiate for common industrial regulations, share designs of factories, and some investment protections, basically making it
Il
easier to
problema di questo è che
operate in
non
other
conta le rivoluzioni,
countries.
cioè non
The
solo in
Entente could
Russia,
respond to this
però
with
anche tipo
railway
la Francia era
standardization,
instabile,
as the train
l'Austria-Ungheria
gauges were
era
very different from
instabile,
France, Russia, and
la
Iberia.
Spagna
Spain
pure.
and Portugal had different train gauges as to deter a French invasion. Following a similar logic, perhaps France could move away from the gauge of Germany, which was standard for Europe at the time. If France were to change their train gauge, it would make German invasion much slower, however also slower for France to advance, while changing the gauges of the entire railway system in France would also be very costly. France is likely going to do this if they expect a defensive war, which considering their position here, I bet that France would be going on the offense, thus this wouldn't happen. Now, I think that
Sono
a
comunque
great war is
schiacciati su due
inevitable to
fronti,
happen
sono
for two key
vicini.
reasons, which is conflict of interest and the fear of the two dominant blocs that they would be overtaken. Earlier in the video, the US of Z avoided the July crisis from escalating because how tight the European economies were, thus making the war too costly for both sides. With this economic Cold War that we would see in the late 1910s, the impact of this would actually be
È vero, questa è
lowered.
tipo una
This
guerra
is because
fredda,
both
però
Middle Europe
tipo
and the
più
Entente
piccola
Economic Union
e
would reduce
prima.
trade with the other, but also reinforce trade among member states. About 4 or 5 years after the July crisis, Germany's trade with France and Russia would plummet, for example. However, trade with Scandinavia and the Balkans would increase to compensate for that. Long story short, due to the economic division of Europe, the continent is no longer tight economically, but rather there are two main economic factions that are self-sufficient for the most part, making a world war to erupt even more likely, because it would not be economically disastrous for either side. By 1918, this would be the situation in Europe. Germany in a rather short amount of time would manage to industrialize the Balkans, but also Austria-Hungary would become more dependent on Germany economically, thus they would fall more into their sphere, which the Habsburgs actually wanted to avoid. I think that Austria-Hungary would be way better off due to the German factories helping them start a domestic production, using
Vogliamo
which
la
they can
guerra,
sustain
vogliamo
fighting
la
in a
guerra, mi sto
prolonged
un po'
war,
rompendo di
but
tutta
also
questa
their
roba,
military reforms are
perché
completed, making them
10
unusually
volte che dice la
capable.
stessa roba.
The Ottomans, I think, would be among the biggest winners. Historically, in 1911 they were beaten by Italy and by 1912 by the Balkan states. However, with German military
odio gli
support and
ottomani.
investments, by 1914 they were at war with Britain and Russia on their border, surviving Gallipoli, taking the Sinai Peninsula, surviving in Iraq and holding the line against Russia in the Caucasus, or basically fighting on 4 fronts and not disintegrating. In this alternate history with roughly 4 more years to prepare, I think that the Ottomans, just like Austria-Hungary, would be unusually more competent than historically. Italy, I assume, would not align with any bloc formally, so they're going to trade freely with the world, but would not secure massive
Ma
investments
secondo
from
me
either
l'Italia fa
side.
il solito opportunista, cioè vede qualcuno un po' perdere. Entriamo soprattutto perché voleva prendersi territori dalla Francia e dall'Austro-Ungheria, quei maledettocci, quegli odiosi. Sì. Poi la Gran Bretagna, beh, la Persia va con la Russia. Il problema di questa roba però, la Russia perché non è ancora scoppiata una rivoluzione? Cioè sì, sarebbe più tardi, però non appena entra in questa guerra la Russia andrebbe in una rivoluzione, quindi la Germania avrebbe basicamente vinto. Wow.
So they would not see any massive changes in terms of their capabilities. The Balkan states would be
Beh,
partitioned between the 2 blocs, and they can see all the benefit immensely from more
l'Albania
railroads,
no.
factories, with Bulgaria especially becoming Germany's strongest partner in the Balkans.
E la Romania
Romania
no.
also benefits from their oil being extracted more efficiently by German companies, who would take
Ah,
part of the profits and buy the rest of the oil at market price. For Scandinavia, it is also similar. German investments makes resource extraction and trade with Germany much easier, thus more profitable for both sides. Now let us look at the Entente Economic Union. Starting with France, their position is not the greatest. It would be stable and wealthy, however proportionately Germany would have grown stronger since 1914. France's only hope would be for Russia to catch up and to challenge Germany, which is why they will be pouring so much investment into Russia rather than their domestic industries. So what would be going on in Russia? Well, the Trans-Siberian Railway would be completed and goods from Asia would travel to Europe quickly and cheaply, negating Britain's advantage of naval trade. Still, this
mhm.
railway was a single track, meaning that it can go only one direction at a time, thus not a huge deal just yet. Other Russian railways may also expand, but due to the vast size of Russia, no major changes would occur by 1918. Economically
Infatti,
speaking,
aggiornare
Russia
tutta
would
la Russia è
benefit
un casino,
greatly, however I'm not sure to
Russia
what
era enorme,
extent.
era
This is
tipo un
because
ottavo
Russian
del
corruption was
territorio
quite real,
globale,
and the Russians were late to the
era
Industrial
tutto attaccato.
Revolution, so they didn't have this tradition. Much of the country was still extremely rural, so the increase in factories doesn't automatically lead to more production, so it would be a slower process as compared to the rest of Europe. As such, I'm going to say that Russia is not yet stronger than Germany economically and perhaps not militarily as well. To finish up on Iberia and other minor countries like Belgium and Luxembourg, there would be some investments, however not as much. French capital would be going overwhelmingly to Russia, so these states wouldn't gain any massive changes. To summarize, both economic factions would improve, however I think that Middle Europe would fare better than the Entente Economic Union by 1918, mostly
Di
because
Dante, che
Austria-Hungary
c'entra
and the Ottoman
Dante?
Empire would improve proportionately faster than Russia. Now regarding how a war could possibly start, I think that Middle Europe would attempt to slow down the growth of Russia, not just by reducing trade with them, but now seeking to disrupt Russia from trading with the outside world. I already covered how Russia cannot reach their economic allies by land due to the position of Middle Europa, so trade would need to be done via the sea, passing through all choke points that are controlled by Middle Europa. As such, I can
Infatti,
see
per la
for
Russia è
them to put
difficilissimo
major tolls on these
mantenersi.
choke points that non-member states would have to pay. This is technically in violation of several treaties, however, for example, instead of putting tolls on the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, it could be the Aegean Islands between Greece and the Ottoman Empire, while in the Baltics, instead of it being the Danish Sound, it can be from Sweden to Bornholm to Germany. Russia is not going to respond kindly to this, as it would slow down their industrialization and negate their advantages. If Russia doesn't escalate this issue, then this guarantees that Middle Europe will outgrow them. As such, Russia would be forced to act and send in their navy as to open up the straits. In the meantime, Russian influence would also be growing in Persia, where
È
the
quello che ho
Russians had
detto da
hoped to secure a warm
40
water
minuti.
port away from Middle Europa. However, Britain would make sure that Russia doesn't have any significant influence in coastal Persia. This would start a whole diplomatic crisis in Europe, where Britain would try to negotiate and prevent war, however for the purposes of this video it would fail. Eventually,
Probabilmente
Russian warships would
fallirebbe
sink a few
comunque.
German and Swedish convoys, resulting in Germany to declare Russia the aggressor, starting a chain of reaction of alliances that would eventually
Sì,
get us through the
tipo la
Great
scorsa
War somewhere
volta.
in 1918. Now, this war wouldn't be directly fought between Middle Europa and the Entente Economic Union. These are trading alliances, not military ones. Think of it like in the modern day that Austria is part of the European Union, however not part of NATO, while Britain is part of NATO, however not part of the European Union. As such, I expect the sides of the war in the beginning to be France, Russia, Belgium, Luxembourg, Serbia and Montenegro against Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman
Quella
Empire
bandiera è
and Sweden.
sbagliata.
Right off the bat, Austria-Hungary
Sì.
would make moves
Anche la
against
Romania,
Serbia,
la
which
Romania
I think that they would
entrerebbe.
be very successful in. This is not because of an earlier Bulgarian involvement. I had already made nearly an hour-long video explaining how the Habsburgs could have been more competent in the Great War. Their main issues were lack of officers, lack of domestic war production, the Alfred-Tredel affair that sold Austrian intelligence to their enemies, to the point that Russia and Serbia knew precisely everything, and the Austrian military reforms during the war. In this alternate history, with the Great War being delayed by around 4 years, Austria-Hungary would have recovered from the Alfred-Tredel affair and created new plans against Serbia and Russia, while their military reforms would be completed, and Germany has helped them greatly in terms of war industry. While Serbia would have also improved in the meantime, there is absolutely no way that they can stand against the Habsburgs. Even further, Albania would likely join Middle Europa. To keep it short, Albania after their
Infatti,
independence
io
had the
l'ho
great
detto.
powers to guarantee their stability. Then the Great War started and all of them pulled out, putting Albania into several civil wars and revolutions. Here, with the
E poi
Great War being
conquista
delayed,
dall'Italia.
Albania would be more stable than historically, as it was mostly Austrian and German peacekeepers there. Thus, Albania would begin to fall into their sphere and likely join the war against Serbia right away. Russia is not going to advance into
Ma
Galicia
quelli
right
neutrali
away.
penso che si allineerebbero tutti con l'Italia o con la Gran Bretagna, quindi l'Albania molto probabilmente con l'Italia che è attaccata, la Puglia e l'Albania sono vicinissime, cioè è più vicina l'Italia all'Albania che l'Italia alla Bosnia anche, quindi sì, però comunque entrerebbe perché sappiamo tutti che cos'è il Kosovo, tutta quella situazione pazza là.
Because historically they did this as a
Questo Kosovo
response to
è
the
una regione
Alfred-Tredel
serbia,
affair, knowing that Austria
forse,
would
o
show up
forse
in
no,
massive
vediamo come
numbers
finisce.
only once Serbia is defeated, allowing Russia to occupy a lot of the region because of set intelligence. Here, Austria-Hungary would hold the line and only lose minor territories. Another major change I think we could see is Britain. As I covered earlier, they want both sides to fight it out, then to step in and ensure a moderate peace treaty where neither side would get the upper edge. Belgium would be in the war, however
Intelligenza.
Britain would argue that Belgium is partially responsible for this war, due to their ally of Russia's aggressive actions in the Baltic Sea leading to this war. The British guarantees on Belgium were not widely known to everybody in Parliament in 1914 historically, so this can be manipulated in this alternate history to secure the best British interests, thus the UK would stay out of the war. Germany would advance quickly against France and only defend against Russia, as I don't think that the Schlieffen plan would be changed. The German High Command would know that Russia being defeated, even if Germany were to go all in on them, would take several years, so Germany would decide to go first on France, isolate Russia and eventually win. With the war starting in 1918, we can potentially see some tanks to be used during wartime.
Epico.
Now this would not be like the historic 1918 tanks used, as historically tank research and production exploded as to counter trench warfare during the war. Without the war
Sarebbero
starting in
un po' peggio.
1914, tanks would be more primitive in this alternate
Un po' come
1918 as compared to historically, however they would
nel
still
16,
exist.
nel
For the Ottoman
1916.
Empire, with British neutrality, this means no Kuwait, Egypt and Gallipoli fronts, thus they can focus solely on the Caucasus against Russia. Now yes, these are major
Con la
mountains, however the
Persia, con
Ottomans
la
can put a lot
strage
of
di
pressure
Persia,
there,
mannaggia la
distracting
miseria.
Russia. The most important thing to mention is that since Britain is not in the war, there is no naval blockade on the Central Powers, as I'm going to be calling them, benefiting the alliance greatly. In the Western Front,
Amico
Germany
mio,
pushes
che
all the way to
poveri
the Meuse
armeni
River,
sono pure
taking roughly half of
facilitati
Belgium and advancing to Liège. However, I can see a
così là.
stalemate to happen here, because Russia would be much ready for war sooner and put pressure to the east. Germany, however, doesn't have to divert a lot of forces to save Austria-Hungary due to the earlier defeat of Serbia, but still Russia would be able to put a lot of pressure on both sides.
Sì.
The year of 1918 would end, and in the winter both sides would continue to mobilize, shift their economies for total war and develop tanks, while the front lines would not be moving massively. In terms of tanks, Russia and France actually had good designs historically, while Germany had a
Perché
few
hai nominato
produced, but their
l'Italia?
historic allies of Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire
Che è
basically never
successo?
used tanks in the Great War. The thing is that in this
La prima
alternate
guerra
history, the
mondiale,
Central
vero?
Powers can have the
Pensavo
better
fosse entrata
tanks,
poi
as
nel
they have a
dopo
solid
la
industry, and they need to go on the
Gran
offense, and
Bretagna
from
e
the
la
Romanian
Spagna.
and
La Spagna
Ottoman
è
Empire
entrata.
oil, this is sustainable. Russia also controls much of the world's oil in the Caucasus, however this oil has no easy access of reaching France. Thus the French would need to buy it from the British rather than their ally of Russia. The British would be happy to provide this trade, as to equal out the playing fields and ensure destruction on continental Europe. In 1919 we can see some major tank
problema della
battles to
Russia è
occur on the
che,
eastern and western fronts. In terms of
non è
colonies, I'm
connessa
going
a
to assume that
nessun
the
mare.
Germans would be at a disadvantage, however they would manage to hold on. Now back to Europe, the war would become a stalemate despite the tanks being used, as the technology is still not ready and the generals are not sure how to implement them into their doctrine. I think that Germany would continue advancing on the western front, while to the east it would remain a stalemate. In the year of 1920, the war would continue to be exhausting for both sides, with not a lot of frontline movements, however millions of casualties. Some nations like Italy, Romania and Greece could be willing to step into the war on either side, however as of now it would be too uncertain. I can see for the Central Powers to begin to make some major moves against Russia, especially in the former Congress of Poland, which would be much less developed than mainland Russia, which was done on purpose by the Russians, whose historic strategy was to let the borderlands be underdeveloped on purpose as to deter an invasion. In 1920 I can see for most of Poland to be occupied, leading to Romania to join the Central Powers and also seize Bessarabia, putting even more pressure on Russia. I can even see for Sweden with the help of Germany to push into Finland and encourage a revolt there, securing most of the area, then
E a questo
directly
punto
threatening
scoppia la
St.
rivoluzione,
Petersburg.
amico mio.
In the year of 1920 I can see for Brussels to fall as well, putting much more pressure on the French. Going into 1921, the tank technologies would be sufficient for both sides, thus the stalemate would shift. I think that Germany would make solid moves against France and would get close to Paris, which would absolutely panic the British, who now would want to end the war. Russia, on the other hand, is not in a great position. They did have more time to industrialize, however not as much as to become stronger than Europe combined. What I find extremely interesting is the social aspect. By this point the war would be going on for nearly 3 years. Thus Russia could suffer from similar problems as it was in 1917 historically, which is lack of food and peasant unrest. In fact, with more Russian industrialization, this could lead to less farmers, making the problem even worse. Russia may have more industry, however the core wouldn't have changed. They would still conscript illiterate peasants and throw them into the meat grinder, slowing down Germany and pushing them back, however at a very high cost. With Russia having a lot more factories, something really interesting would occur. Most of these factories would not be Russian owned, thus parts of the profits would be going to France rather than the workers. We already saw this historically with the Bolsheviks wanting the workers to own the factories, and this happened in a much rural and less urbanized Russia. Here with more factories but still poor living and worker conditions, there would be more factory workers that would support the communist ideas than historically, creating a larger issue for the Russian Empire, despite being stronger on paper. As such, I can see for some domestic pressure, like some strikes that would continue to weaken the Russian Empire. Had the Great War not started in 1918 but was delayed by a decade or two, I have no doubt that Russia would be among the strongest countries in the world, and could single-handedly defeat all of continental Europe combined. However, this would not be the case here. As such, in 1921, living conditions would start to deteriorate in Russia, giving the advantage to the Central Powers that would also be nearing in Paris. This would result in Britain to intervene and demand peace. We can even see for Italy to join the Central Powers as to have a few thousand dead and to dictate the peace treaty, getting some compensations. Britain would have insane leverage here, because the side that they would join would win this war. Thus they can threaten both sides as to make sure that the war stops in the current state of stalemate, before one side wins a crucial victory and dominates the continent. Britain would be aware of the potential fall of France or Russia, so they would threaten Germany first, telling them that they would join the war against them if they don't sign peace. Since the war started over economic reasons and the industrialists would have a lot of power, just like how the USOZ set up this scenario in the beginning, I think that this would go through, and in 1921 the Great War would end with a negotiated peace. In the treaty, Germany seizes Luxembourg and parts of eastern Belgium, along with border territories from France. Italy, if they are allowed to, would take Nice, Savoy and Tunisia, but likely not Corsica, as Britain doesn't want any more competition in the Mediterranean Sea. In the Balkans.
Mettiamoci d'accordo su una cosa. Siete anche voi d'accordo che la Corsica è territorio italiano? È abitato da italiani. Io sono stato in Corsica, parlano italiano. Anche parlano più inglese che francese, mamma mia. La Corsica è italiana.
Serbia and Montenegro would be partitioned between
Io sono stato in due posti in Francia, Corsica e Nizza, posti italiani praticamente.
Bulgaria, Albania, and Austria-Hungary.
Oddio,
Romania will take Bessarabia. In Eastern Europe, Germany would be allowed to take the Congress of Poland, and Sweden likely takes Finland. In the Caucasus, the Ottomans are likely to seize the entire region and establish the puppet state of the Mountain Republic. As such, this is how Europe would look like
La
after the
Cecenia.
war. Colonially speaking, I don't think that Britain would allow any major changes. No German into China, for example. Rather, German Cameroon is expanded and potentially Madagascar is taken by Germany, that's it.
Sì,
With
questo
that,
è.
this would be the
O anche il
peace
Benin.
treaty.
Il Benin
Because
va
it
alla
happened so
Germania.
soon, Russia going communist would be less likely, as they're not fighting a civil war during a war with Germany. As such, after the war, they can focus on containing these socialist revolts and likely winning against them.
No,
The
non
Central
vincono, non
Powers, on the other
vincono,
hand,
dico.
did expand greatly, however, the heavy human cost that likely wasn't worth it. Still, Middle Europe would have secured trade concessions from the Entente Economic Union, while their enemies would likely be forced to pay war
Poi
reparations, as
probabilmente la
Russia would be
Polonia
blamed for
invaderebbe la
starting this
Russia.
war. Germany could economically control much of Europe, which would scare the British greatly. In response, Britain can try to create their own economic alliance and try to pull away some German member states like Greece or Romania that no
Sì, la
longer
Grecia
have a
direi
need
di
to
sì.
work with Germany. Italy joining this British-led economic alliance I think is plausible as well. The Scandinavian
Sì, anche
Economic Union
questo.
can also be influenced
Poi
by the
magari anche
British.
l'Albania,
The United
perché
Kingdom would
ormai
have
non ha più
more or
bisogno
less
della
achieved their
Germania nemmeno
desired
quella.
goal, make both of their rivals of Russia and Germany go to
Anzi,
war,
per
exhaust
l'Albania è
themselves,
meglio
and now
essere
Britain would have
alleati
secured their
dell'Italia che
hegemony for a
della
few more
Germania.
decades. The thing is that Germany is likely going to recover eventually, which would scare Britain once again. However, their allies of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire would be rather unstable after the war, due to a
Infatti.
wave of nationalism. If there is going to be a second world war, I'm going to say that this would occur at a similar time as historically, with the sides being France, Italy, Russia, Britain, Greece, Romania, Belgium, fighting against Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, with Sweden being influenced by Britain and likely going neutral and abandoning Germany, not wanting to lose Finland as there is nothing to gain but rather everything to lose. Germany is absolutely not in a great position for this alternate Second World War, while Russia likely continues to
Schiacciato.
industrialize,
È
now
tipo la
with
prima
British
guerra mondiale, ma più tardi. Ma più tipo la prima guerra mondiale, però diversa. Cioè, esiste, non c'è la Serbia e c'è la Polonia. Un po' più di vantaggio per la Germania, però comunque è fottuta.
investments as well. As such, the Central Powers, in my opinion, are guaranteed to secure a short-term victory, however long-term, unless they somehow get America on their side, they're going to lose this war. The front lines are just not too favorable for Germany, and half of their allies literally suck. On the other hand, in the
Infatti.
modern day, Albania and the United States of America account for roughly 66% of NATO spending. Now, with Albania being much larger and also aligned to Germany, the nation can carry the Central Powers and ensure their
Albania.
victory, but who knows? Thank you again to the USOFZ for this collaboration. I'm sure that he's going to comment something very funny in the comment section, so check out his channel for more alternate history videos. For now, I'm going to suggest that you check out the video on the screen and goodbye.
E amici miei, goodbye. Chi lo dice anche? Io. Raga, spero che questo video vi sia piaciuto davvero e spero che il video nel video vi sia piaciuto pure quello, perché a me è piaciuto. Scenario bello, ho fatto un bel reality check e è realistico, tranne per la Russia che sarebbe caduta in rivoluzione. Però vabbè, a quel punto magari pure la Svezia sarebbe preso pure Kola, Karelia indipendente, Arkhangelsk tutta ingrandita e poi vabbè, tipo eh, i Baltici indipendenti, però quelli sono un classico e Polonia più grossa. Poi il resto sì, bello realistico, bellissima l'immagine di chi era Bismarck? No, era Guglielmo II Napoleone, molto bella, l'adoro. E sì, questo video mi è piaciuto. Se volete più, come si dice, reaction, scrivetelo nei commenti. Il prossimo video non è reaction, vabbè, oltre a Wixo, non è reaction perché è Damnation, torna finalmente. Già, faccio tipo pause di 2 mesi e poi a caso Damnation. E quindi sì, votate nel sondaggio che stato dovrei fare. Facciamo, facciamo, che ne so, seguiamo questo video. Però direi sì, un bel video. e bel video, anche il mio reality check. Detto questo, se non vi siete iscritti vi picchio e oltre a questo, fine. Il video è finito, quindi Sturagno vi saluta, ci vediamo al prossimo video. Ciao!